To drive this transformation, we've just launched the Major Projects Office. Its job is to fast-track major nation-building projects.
Imagine a morning when the whole world wakes up to the sounds of a trade war. Washington raises tariff walls, promising to bring back jobs and make America great again. But behind those walls, something unexpected is happening. A country that has remained in the shadow of the American economy for decades is transforming into the new industrial center of North America. Quiet, calculating, cold Canada suddenly becomes a symbol of economic revival.
By buying Canadian. And to these ends, our new government is embarking on an ambitious plan to secure a new era of prosperity out of this age of adversity.
It all started with tariffs. Metal, cars, wood, entire industries were hit. The White House celebrated victory, while allies counted their losses. But Ottawa saw it differently. Not as a threat, but as an opportunity. When the United States began to close itself off, Canada opened its doors. While Washington talked about protectionism, the Canadian government announced, "If America builds walls, we will build the future." In just a few months, the lights came back on in the tired factories of Ontario and Quebec. Factories that were about to close for good began receiving orders from Europe and Asia. Engineers are returning home, and investors are moving their offices from Silicon Valley to Toronto and Vancouver. For the first time in decades, the industrial map of the continent is changing, and not in favor of the US.
Our new industrial strategy will help transform our economy from being overly reliant on the United States to one that is more resilient to global shocks. A new economy that's built on the solid foundation of Canadian industries, Canadian workers, and it's bolstered by diverse international trading partners.
The White House talks about protecting jobs, but in reality, workers are moving north. While America argues about visas, Canada is opening its borders to talent. While the US is raising tariffs, Ottawa is lowering taxes for engineers and manufacturers. And suddenly the world sees that a country that has always played by someone else's rules is starting to dictate its own. $5 billion, that's how much the Canadian government has invested in its own future. But this is not just a support program. It is a declaration of independence. A new course, where the domestic market becomes a weapon and industry a symbol of national confidence. There are no loud slogans in this cold calculation, only precise steps. New contracts, new factories, new industries from defense to green energy. While the United States argues with itself, Canada is making deals with Europe and Asia, launching its own reactors, building trains and ships. Where once the echoes of American politics were heard, now the confident voice of Ottawa is heard.
Giving our workers and our companies the tools they need, retraining our workers, transforming our strategic sectors, creating entirely new industries, and being our own best customer.
How did this happen? Why has a country that for decades was considered dependent on Washington suddenly become the industrial flagship of the continent? And what will happen next? Will America withstand the blow of its own economic policy? Today, we will tell you how the tariff storm that originated in the White House has led to Canada experiencing a real industrial renaissance. How an economy built on raw material exports is transforming into a center of technology, manufacturing, and ideas. And why the whole world is now looking north, where a new era for North America is beginning. The trade storm that began in Washington looked like a confident step toward the revival of American power. President Donald Trump, returning for a second term, promised the same thing he had been saying since the beginning, to bring manufacturing back home, put America first, and make the world respect American workers. The White House assured that the new wave of tariffs would be a salvation for the industrial belt, reviving Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. To the sound of fanfare, the US announced an increase in duties on metal, cars, wood, and even certain categories of electronics. But no one expected that this move would not only provoke a wave of retaliation, but also change the very map of economic influence in North America.
So that our defense estimates, which will be enormous, our defense investments support the growth of Canadian industries and create Canadian jobs and careers. We'll begin this month our negotiations of a new defense and security partnership with the European Union. And we launched a new trade diversification strategy to develop new export markets. We will soon also release our climate competitiveness strategy to position Canada as a leader in decarbonization.
In the first few weeks, it all looked like a victory. US state television channels showed footage from factories where workers were supposedly returning to their machines, but it soon became clear that these were only symbolic gestures. The real consequences hit the Allies, those who had been building their economies in close cooperation with America for decades. Canada found itself at the epicenter of the crisis. Its metallurgy, machine building, and forestry industries were more dependent on American markets than those of any other country. When tariffs rose, hundreds of businesses were on the verge of bankruptcy. In the first months after the tariffs were introduced, the Canadian press was full of headlines about an inevitable recession. The Prime Minister's ratings plummeted, and analysts predicted capital flight and rising unemployment. But behind the scenes in Ottawa, a different plan was taking shape. Not a counter-complaint, not a diplomatic note, but a strategy. In one of the closed-door meetings, according to leaks from the Canadian Ministry of Industry, it was said, "If they close the door, we'll build our own house." This phrase would later become a symbol of a new era, an era when Canada stopped waiting for Washington to allow it to breathe. The first signs of the coming crisis became apparent just 3 months later. American companies began to lose contracts in Europe, where suppliers refused to work with firms subject to secondary tariffs. While the White House assured that America is manufacturing again, investors were leaving for Asia and Canada, ironically calling Toronto the new Detroit. International publications wrote about a quiet revolution in the North. Contrary to expectations, Canada's economy did not weaken, but began to adapt quickly, decisively, without loud statements.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
The turning point came in January, when Ottawa announced the creation of a $5 billion industrial fund. To an outside observer, this looked like just another anti-crisis measure, but within the country, this step was perceived almost as a political statement. The fund was unofficially named Protect. Its mission was simple: to save what could still be saved and restore what seemed lost forever. The program was based on two principles: complete independence and priority for Canadian manufacturers. Government contracts, from steel for bridges to parts for railways, were now distributed only among companies registered in Canada. This was not just an economic move, but an ideological shift. The country, which for decades had been considered second fiddle in the North American economy, began to play by its own rules.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
In the first weeks after the fund was launched, workers who had previously been laid off from metallurgical enterprises began to return to Ontario and Quebec. Newspapers published photos of lit blast furnaces, as if they had come to life after a long sleep. At one of the plants in Hamilton, steel production grew by 40% in just 6 months for the first time since the 1980s. And in Sorel Tracy, where mass layoffs had previously been planned, new jobs were created. According to local unions, about 18,000 workers who lost their jobs due to U.S. tariffs had already secured new contracts by the middle of the year. But it wasn't just about jobs. Protecting the domestic market became the foundation of a new industrial philosophy. Now the goal was not survival, but restructuring the economy according to its own standards. The government launched a large-scale import substitution program inspired by Europe's post-war experience. Where American components had previously been purchased, domestic production began to develop. This applied not only to steel and aluminum, but also to high-tech components such as control systems, software, and electronics.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
The results were faster than even the optimists had expected. At the same time, dependence on the American market fell by almost a third. This came as an unpleasant surprise to Washington. American analysts began to openly say that the tariff policy had backfired. Instead of weakening Canada, it actually financed its industrialization. Against this backdrop, Canadian society began what journalists called an industrial awakening. For the first time in many years, residents of industrial regions felt pride in national production. The slogan "Buy Canadian" ceased to be an advertising cliché, it became a formula for survival. Political scientists noted that a new type of patriotism had emerged in the country, not emotional but rational, based on belief in one's own capabilities. Meanwhile, in the US, the situation was developing in the opposite direction. Despite loud statements, the flow of investment began to decline, and large companies were moving their orders abroad. Against the backdrop of constant trade disputes and rising costs, businesses were losing confidence. When Canada launched a tax incentive program for companies that relocated their production from American territory, the number of applications exceeded all expectations. In the first 3 months, more than 120 companies from Michigan, Illinois, and Pennsylvania began registering branches in Ontario. Among them were manufacturers of auto parts, electrical equipment, and even farming cooperatives.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Economists called it a quiet industrial migration. The US was building walls, while Canada was opening its gates. New technology parks appeared in Toronto, industrial clusters in Montreal, and investment platforms for green startups in Alberta. To the world, it looked like a revolution. A country that until recently had been considered an economic appendage of the US was becoming an independent player. At the same time, the Canadian government acted with restraint. No loud statements, no threats or antagonism. On the contrary, at all international forums, Ottawa emphasized its commitment to cooperation and open markets. But behind this diplomatic facade was a tough strategy, protecting interests at any cost. The Ministry of Industry spoke bluntly: if the US continues to raise tariffs, Canada will respond not symmetrically, but effectively. In other words, not with mirror measures, but with the development of its own production, which would render the tariffs meaningless. Gradually, international experts began to call what was happening the Canadian phenomenon. Within a year, the country, having lost access to key American markets, not only survived but also restarted its industry. Production grew by almost 4%, and investor confidence rose to record levels. Financial publications noted that, for the first time in decades, Ottawa had stopped reacting to Washington's actions and had started to act first.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Thus, a new economic reality was born. Canada, long perceived as a junior partner to the US, showed that it was not only capable of surviving under pressure, but also of turning that pressure into an engine of growth. And although Washington did not officially mention this, behind closed doors there were increasing signs of alarm. The tariff war, conceived as a means of strengthening American industry, had become a catalyst for its northern competitor. While the White House was searching for explanations, the North was already laying the groundwork for the next step, the transition from defense to creation. The Canadian economy was entering a new phase, where the crisis became fuel for renewal, and tariffs became a tool for rebirth. And it was then that it became clear North America would never be the same again. The initial successes of the Protect program were just the beginning. Having protected key industries and restored thousands of jobs, Ottawa realized that simply staying afloat was not enough. Canada should not just survive, but thrive. Thus began the next phase, the industrial rebirth of the country, based on the idea, we no longer ask for access to markets, we create them. It was at this moment that the Create program was born in government circles, a transition from protection to creation, from dependence to strategic leadership.
And that we take good note of what they're saying. So it's not as if what the Secretary of Commerce has mentioned.
We compete. There are areas where we compete, and it's in those areas where we have to come to an agreement that works. But there are more areas where we are stronger together, and that's what we're focused on. And we're going to get the right deal for America, right deal, obviously, from my perspective, for Canada.
The main impetus for this transition was the atmosphere that prevailed in the world. The US, mired in its own tariff policy, faced a slowdown in domestic production. Europe was looking for new trade routes, and Asia was increasing its technological presence. Amid this chaos, Canada looked like an island of stability, a country where the rules of the game did not change every week. Against the backdrop of American isolation, the Canadian economy began to take shape as an independent pole of influence. The first steps of the Create phase were aimed at turning the crisis into a catalyst for modernization. The Ministry of Industry's report stated explicitly, every closed border is an opportunity to open a new industry. As a result, the state approved dozens of projects in the fields of defense technology, energy, engineering, and infrastructure. Old shipyards, where Allied ships were once built during World War II, now began to build modern vessels for the Arctic Command. All components, from steel sheets to electronic systems, were manufactured domestically. This step not only provided thousands of jobs, but also became a symbol of economic independence. For the first time in many years, Canada was building military equipment without the involvement of American contractors. At the same time, a campaign for technological renewal was launched. The government introduced grants for universities and research centers, bringing them together with the private sector into a single innovation network. This led to the creation of the first consortia for the development of quantum computing systems and neural networks for defense purposes. The press called these projects mini-Canadian DARPA, hinting at their role in strengthening national security and technological autonomy.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
But the main symbols of the new industrial era were two projects: the construction of a high-speed railway between Toronto and Quebec City, and the launch of a small modular reactor program in Darlington. Both projects became a showcase of sorts for the new policy, a combination of industrial pragmatism and strategic vision. The railway line, estimated to cost more than $60 billion, was intended not only to connect the country's economic centers, but also to serve as an example of how the state can stimulate industry without resorting to protectionism. The condition was simple: all materials, equipment, and safety systems had to be manufactured in Canada. As a result, hundreds of companies received orders, and thousands of engineers and builders found stable employment. In the energy sector, the focus was on new technologies. Miniature reactors designed for northern regions became a laboratory for the introduction of clean energy and autonomous control systems. In one of the test projects in Alberta, a reactor running on recycled fuel was successfully launched, an event that immediately made the front pages of international publications. It was at that moment that the world realized that Canada was not just catching up with the technological leaders, but was forming its own school of engineering thinking.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
The private sector responded unexpectedly quickly. While large corporations preferred to wait and see at the beginning of the crisis, they have now begun to invest in new industries. Against the backdrop of U.S. tariffs and political uncertainty, Canada has come to look like a safe haven. Within a year, private investment in industry grew by almost a third. The green energy sector, solar panels, batteries, waste processing grew particularly rapidly. Construction began in Manitoba on North America's largest electric vehicle battery manufacturing plant. This was a painful signal for the American automotive industry. The supply chain was shifting north. At the same time, the country faced a new dilemma. Industrial growth required personnel, technology, and capital. This marked the beginning of the third stage, Attract, aimed at attracting global talent and investment. Once again, Canada went in the opposite direction from the US. While the White House was introducing visa fees and restrictions on work visas, Ottawa launched the Talent North and Campus Canada programs, providing preferential terms for engineers, scientists, and students from Europe, India, and Southeast Asia. In a matter of months, universities received a record number of applications, and technology companies opened dozens of new research centers.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
Neighborhoods began to spring up in Toronto and Calgary that the press dubbed the second Silicon Valley. International corporations moved their offices from Seattle and San Francisco, explaining it simply, in Canada, you can plan. The influx of investment was so rapid that the federal government was forced to create a separate department to control foreign capital in order to avoid overheating the market.